Chapter 11 is probably one of the most important chapters of CA 150. It really is the bulk of what we do in our labs. And as I said, it forms the basis for what you are going to be doing with other classes throughout your career here in the program and what you do out in the industry as well. So chapter 11 is over stocks and sauce making. So let's talk about stocks first. What is a stock? The most basic definition is it's a flavored liquid, but it's even more than that. The quality of your finished stock is the key to a great soup, a great sauce, or a great braised dish. In fact, the French thought so highly of stock, they call stock fond, F-O-N-D, fond, which means base, because it is the base for many classic and modern dishes that we see being used. Now, there are four basic types of stock. We have white stock, brown stock, fish stock or fish fumé, fun word to say, and this last one, I know it looks like court, but again, we're talking French here, so it's court bouillon. All right, so we're going to talk about these different types of stock, how they differ, how they're the same, and how we go about making them and what we can use them for. For stock, for the most part, has a basic set of ingredients. The first is, of course, the bones. That's going to be your main flavoring agent. And so beef, veal, chicken, fish are very common. You can do more specialty stocks. You could do lamb stock, game stocks, ham stocks, turkey stocks. You know, any of those are really fair game. Anything that you can get a bone from, you can turn around and make a stock out of it if you so choose. The biggest difference is it a specialized stock really that has a specific flavor that has to go with, or is it something you can use for a lot of different things? The next item is another fancy French word that you really need to know. In fact, it will be on your test. You need to know what it means. And that word there is mirepoix. So this word right here in the middle is mirepoix. And mirepoix is a combination of 50% onion, 25% carrot, 25% celery. So let's say the recipe calls for 1 pound of mirepoix. Okay, so we know there's 16 ounces in a pound. 50% of that means we need 8 ounces of onion, we need 4 ounces of carrot, and 4 ounces of celery, and that would give us the pound of mirepoix. If it just says mirepoix, it assumes that you know what that means and you know the ratios. So you are required for the test and for being a professional in this industry, you need to know what are the 3 ingredients that make up mirepoix and what are the percentages. And I will guarantee you it will be on your test. Then the last thing, of course, is different seasonings and flavorings. And so primarily what we use, and this is going back to a previous chapter, is we usually use a sachet. So crushed peppercorns, bay leaf, thyme, parsley stems, clove goes in there as well. That gets all wrapped up in cheesecloth and then thrown in. I don't use garlic because if I want to do garlic, I'll add garlic on my own. I don't want to necessarily always have garlic. Not that there's anything wrong with garlic. Love garlic, but I want the option to put as much or little garlic as I want, not something that's going into that base, that foamed. And never, 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 ever, 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 never, never, ever did I mention never, ever add salt to a stock. A stock, remember, is a base. It is not a finished product. So you never add salt to that stock. Salt and season when you get to the finished dish. There's a visual representation for you as far as mirepoix, 50% onion, 25% carrots, 25% celery. There is an alternative that you can do called a white mirepoix. And a white mirepoix, you substitute the carrots and you use mushroom trimmings or leeks. And if you're doing something that's a very pale stock, like a fish stock, that you don't want a bunch of color in, you want to keep it pale, substitute out the carrots. It's where you get added more color to it and use those mushroom trimmings and or leeks in place of it. No matter what type of stock you're making, there are some basic principles for making stock. First, you always start your stock in cold water. That allows it to draw out natural gelatin and draw out more of the flavor profile from the bones and stuff than if you're starting it in hot water. The other thing, too, is hot water contains impurities because it's going through your hot water heater, which can then give your stock a cloudy nature to it instead of a nice crystal clear product. You always want to simmer the stock gently. No, don't boil the stock because any impurities that come up, you're going to skim. If you don't skim those impurities, they fall back down into the stock and it can make your stock cloudy. Once it's done its amount of cooking, then you want to strain the stock. Make sure you just have the liquid left. Cool it quickly through the two-stage cooling process to get through the temperature danger zone. Make sure you keep it stored, refrigerated, or frozen. And then, of course, degrease the stock before you use it because there will be some fat that will be released through the bones and such, and you want to make sure you remove those. But the nice thing is once you chill it, that grease will actually solidify, and so you'll get what they call a fat cap on the top of the stock that you can, like in most cases, just remove with your hands or with a spoon before you get down to the actual stock itself. So no matter what type of stock you're making, those are some basic principles that work across the board. In addition, just as a reminder, we're cooling and handling stock. We want to make sure we're doing this two-stage cooling to keep stock out of the temperature danger zone. So if you remember that from sanitation, you got to get from 135 to 70 within 2 hours. And then you have from 70 to below 41, and you got additional 4 hours to get that done. You do need to make sure you're documenting that for HACCP purposes. And also it's just one of those covering your behind when it's all said and done, so you can show if the health department has an issue, here's where the stock was at temperatures and the times that go along with it. So please make sure you're being very diligent about that. So let's talk stock. So a white stock is one of the most basic of stock making. It's a neutral flavored stock made from beef, veal, or chicken bones, typically. If you are working with beef and veal, you might want to blanch the bones first, where you take the bones, cover them with water, bring it to a boil, and then once it comes to a boil, skim off the impurities, drain that water, and then refill with cold water and start as a stock recipe. It's kind of helping to hedge your bet just to make sure there's no less chance of impurities getting into your stock and clouding things up. I don't typically do it with chicken bones just because the bones are smaller and I don't want to pull a bunch of flavor from it that I would then be pulling down the drain afterwards. But if you're doing white beef or veal stock, it's usually a good idea to blanch them first just to hedge your bet to make sure you get a nice clear finished product. Brown stock, on the other hand, first, you do not blanch the bones. And you can make stock, again, chicken, veal, beef, or even game is fair play for it. When you're going to do a brown stock, what you do first is caramelize the bones. So put the bones in a roasting pan and then roast them until they get nice and golden brown. Book says an hour at 375, depends on what you're using. If you got the combi oven going, it's going to maybe take 20, 30 minutes. So not going to necessarily take that hour. Want to make sure that you flip them occasionally just so they brown evenly on all sides, but we don't want them to burn on us. And then those bones would go into the stock pot. So there's a visual representation of the bones getting all nice and caramelized. Once you've removed the bones from the roasting pan, put it in the stock pot, then you're going to deglaze the pan, and that's getting that those pieces of meat, or what they call the fond as well, the base, off of your pan, and add that flavor into your stock. So you would put the pan on the stovetop, add a little bit of water to the bottom, and then scrape the bottom of the pan to dissolve any of the caramelized material that's there. And then that liquid goes into the stock pot as well, again, adding more color, adding more flavor. Visual of pouring the water on the stovetop with burners going to deglaze the pan. Then once you've deglazed the pan, then you add the mirepoix, and you Well, I roast it. I throw it in the oven. The book says saute it. I'd rather throw it in the oven, let it do its work, and I can work on something else instead of having to stand over and saute or caramelize the mirepoix altogether. So I do it a little bit differently than the book does, but either way, it's not going to hurt one way or the other. So you can see again the caramelizing of the mirepoix that's done for that brown stock, and we will be doing all of that when it comes to making our brown stocks next for the next lab. Once you've gotten all the brown, all the stuff caramelized and ready to go, then you add your water, you add your rest of your ingredients, and you let them simmer until they're done. So fish stock and fish fumet. Fish stock or fumet is made from either fish bones and heads and or crustacean shells. So shells of lobster, shrimp, crab, et cetera, et cetera. Typically, oily fish are not used because it has too strong of a flavor. So you're usually not using shark bones or salmon bones. I mean, if you wanted to do a salmon stock, you could, but it's going to have a very distinct flavor. So you're not going to be able to use it necessarily for some tilapia or anything like that, because the salmon stock, the flavor of that salmon would overpower the flavor of the tilapia itself. So that's why, and if you're doing just a general fish stock, you usually don't use oily fish. Bones are not blanched because of their size, and we don't want to lose the flavor. The difference between a stock and a fumet is that a fumet contains an acidic ingredient like lemon juice or white wine in addition to the stock ingredients. So it's helping to up the flavor profile and make it a little bit stronger. You're going to find also stocks and fumets take a lot less time to work. Once you get them simmering, usually about 35 to 40 minutes. Most white stocks and brown stocks usually go for hours. 4 to 6 is usually average for a white stock. 6 to 8 is usually average for a brown stock. But with a fish stock, an hour is usually more than sufficient. Vegetable stock, there's no bones obviously with for vegetable stocks. You're using the different veggies, but if you're looking for a substitute for a meat stock, or if you're doing a vegetarian dish, it doesn't make sense to throw chicken stock into something that you're trying to make vegetarian. So what it is the basic stock, but instead of adding bones, you're adding other and more vegetables. You're going to find, though, it's going to be very watery. It's not going to have a lot of body to it because there's no gelatin being extracted like there is in the meat stocks, because the gelatin is coming from the bones here and there. So you want to be careful about very strongly flavored vegetables. So be careful of things like broccoli, cauliflower, things along those lines, Brussels sprouts. Also, you want to avoid starchy vegetables like potatoes, corn, things like that, because that will release the starch into the stock, which will make it cloudy. So, but you can do very specific flavors. Maybe you want to do a celery stock because you are doing a celery poached chicken breast. And so you want to add that extra punch of celery in there, and other mirepoix ingredients and mushrooms, what have you, but you're doing extra celery, so you pull out that extra sweet celery flavor to go along with it. Or you can do just a general basic vegetable stock that works across the board wherever you need it to go. But you can have some fun, change things up a little bit if you want to do yourself a vegetable stock. So in this day and age, of course, not most places are not necessarily making stock from scratch. They're using either some canned broth or what they're calling bone broth, which is a fancy name for stock nowadays, or they're using these different commercial bases that you just add water. They're either powder or paste form. You add water and it's used as a replacement. But even the best bases are really a poor substitute for a well-made stock itself. If you're going to use some commercial bases, make sure you are comparing the different brands, because not all brands are created equal. So check out the brands and the prices and see which is going to work best for you. Note, with most commercial bases, sodium or salt is probably going to be one of the main ingredients in there. So it does, you need to take that into consideration if you're cooking something for a long period of time. What I recommend for students, if you're using bases and such, go ahead and put your base together, but then throw in some mirepoix in a sachet and let it simmer for 40 minutes or an hour to extract some of those other flavors, just to help give it a little bit more in-depth flavor profile. Just food for thought if it's something that interests you. But just note that commercial bases are out there and they do get used, but make sure you are being very conscientious of which ones you're using and which works best for you. Court bouillon. So court bouillon technically is not a stock, but we prepare it very similar. What it is, it's a cooking liquid that's usually used for cooking fish and shellfish. So water, wine or vinegar, mirepoix, sachet, all goes in to pull flavors and aromas. And then you would actually use that to, let's say, simmer shrimp for shrimp cocktail, or poach a salmon. So the reason why is, as you know, hopefully you've noticed, water is going to pull flavors from the ingredients that you put into there, hence why we make stock. Well, that's great if you're trying to pull them from bones, not so good when you are cooking shrimp and want the shrimp to actually taste like shrimp and not taste like nothing. If you try to cook the shrimp in just water, you're going to pull the shrimp flavor from the shrimp into the water. By cooking it in a court bouillon, yes, you're pulling some shrimp flavor out into the water, but it's also being exchanged for this nice seasoned liquid that's then going into the shrimp itself. So it helps to give you a more complete rounded flavor. Then what you can do a lot of times with court bouillon is make what's called a nage. That's that word there at the bottom. The N-A-G-E is a nage. And a nage is an aromatic court bouillon that's served as its own sauce. So it's not thickened or anything. It's just very thin. You cook the fish or shellfish or even chicken or whatever in the court bouillon, and then you serve it with that liquid that's left. And it's called a nage. So again, another fancy French term there. Another more modern technique, if you want to think of it that way, is infusions. And infusions are just very light, flavorful stocks where you draw out flavors from other items such as dried fruits or vegetables, herbs or spices steeped in hot water. So, for example, when you make tea or you make coffee, you are making an infusion. Probably the most well-known infusions is dashi. Dashi is a Japanese broth that is used for a lot of different things. That's probably the most well-known, as that's considered an infusion. But you could, steep different herbs or spices into hot water and then use that as a cooking medium or use that as a sauce medium. Same thing with the dried fruits or working with vegetables, things along those lines. Something a little different than what you would see with your traditional sauce-making processes. A glaze. A glaze is you take your finished stock and you simmer it to evaporate the water. It's a dramatically reduced stock. So the basic ratio is 1 gallon of stock produces 1 to 2 cups of glaze. I go to the 1 cup side. So if you know that there are, 8 ounces in a cup, and that each cup is a pint. So each 2 pints is a quart, each 4 quarts is a gallon. If you do the math, you can figure out that it makes 16 cups equals 1 gallon. 16 cups equals 1 gallon if you do the math. And so if you're taking 16 cups and reducing it down to just 1 cup of finished product, so that means your ratio is 15 to 1. So if you have 1 cup of glaze, you add 15 cups of water, and now you've reconstituted it back to a gallon. All right, so that's the way, if you want to use it as a natural base, there's a cool way of doing it. And that's why I always take it down to the 1 cup. So it's a 15 to 1 ratio. Just makes it easier when you're reconstituting. So there are actually 3 types of glaze in the French terms. The 2 are the most common. So this first one is glace de viande. Glace de viande. And glace de viande is made from typically brown beef stock or brown stock. Then the other one is glace de volaille. Glace de volaille. Glace de volaille is made from white stock, usually like a white chicken stock. The last one, it's not there, you don't see as often, is glace de poisson. Glace de poisson is typically made from fish stock. but again, don't use that as often. Nice thing about making these glosses or these glazes is if you're making large batches of stock and you want to freeze them, you know, a gallon takes up a lot more space than a cup does in your freezer. So if you reduce them down to glazes, you can throw them in your freezer. You take up less space to store them for long periods of time. And then all you got to do is add water back to them in order to get back the stock that you originally started with. So kind of a cool thing, especially when space is at a premium. So that is talking about the stocks. Now let's move on and look at sauces. So what is a sauce? A sauce, by definition, is a liquid plus a thickening agent plus flavors and seasonings. So when you're making a sauce, there's some basic things to take in consideration. First, use a good base. Make sure you start with good stock. Use the thickening agent correctly and properly so you get the right texture, flavor, and appearance. And then use your seasonings properly to achieve the flavors that you want, to bring out the flavors. Don't over-season especially. The most common thickening agent is what's called roux, R-O-U-X. That's roux. Roux, by definition, is a combination of equal parts by weight of flour and fat. That is a test answer, ladies and gentlemen. I will ask you, what is roux? Your answer, a combination of equal parts by weight, flour and fat. And that's the answer right then and there. What gets most people tripped up is the last word, fat. They end up substituting a specific fat. They'll say equal parts by weight of flour and butter. That's technically wrong because it's not just butter that it has to be used to make roux. Any fat is fair game. Classically, the most common fat is clarified butter. But you can use whole butter. You could use olive oil. You could use vegetable oil. You could use bacon grease. You can use, any type of fat is fair game to make a roux. It's just that equal parts by weight of flour and fat mixed together. Right? Once you mix the two ingredients together in equal parts, then you're going to heat it on the stove. If you heat it on the stove just briefly to put it together, you've made a white roux. If you cook it a little bit longer, it takes on a little bit slightly darker color, you get a blonde roux. If you cook it down until it develops a real dark color with a little bit of a nutty aroma, then you are getting a brown roux. Those are the three types of roux. And there's a visual representation of the three. So white roux, of course, you would use in very light colored sauces. Blonde roux are going to be used in what they can call ivory color sauces. So they have a little color to them, but not totally dark. And then brown roux is used in your darker color sauces. Okay? They're all the same ingredients, equal parts by weight, fat and flour, but the difference is how long you leave them on the stove so they caramelize. They start the caramelization process and you get these different colors that come from it and some slightly different flavors as well. Okay? So that is the main one. Very, 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 very important. Okay? Know what's in a roux. Know the three different types of roux. Now, you've made the roux. You have the liquid. How do you incorporate the two? So in a classic sauce making process, you make the roux in one pan, you heat the liquid in the other, and then you combine them together. You don't make what we would consider like a pan gravy, where you make the roux in a pan and then you just add liquid directly from the container to it, like you're making sausage gravy for breakfast or something. That's a pan gravy. That wouldn't be considered a classic style sauce because you're not pulling it together the same way. But there are two ways to incorporate roux into a liquid without causing lumps. First, you can add a cool stock to a hot roux, stirring it with a whisk, or a room temperature roux to a hot stock. So you want to make sure once you make that roux, let it come off the heat for a little bit, especially if you have a hot stock, because if you add a hot roux to a hot stock, part of it's going to separate and you're not going to get the flour that's going to blend seamlessly into the finished product. What you're doing by mixing the fat and the flour is you're creating the base for that gelatinization. That allows the flour to then absorb into the liquid that you're trying to thicken. And then once it gets heated, then the sauce thickens because the flour gelatinizes. homogenizes. But it's very imperative that you are consistent with your temperatures, because if you add a cold stock to a cold roux, it's really not going to work. If you add a really hot roux to a really hot stock, it's not going to work either. So you got to make sure. I've always said, make your roux, take it off the heat, let it set for a minute or two. And then if you have your liquid like a simmer or so, you can whisk that in and you should be good to go. Some other guidelines for using roux: a heavy non-reactive pot will help prevent scorching and help prevent discoloration. Make sure your roux is not cooler than room temperature when combining into liquid, because your fat, depending on what fat you're using, might solidify. If you're using butter, the butter would solidify, and that's going to be really tough to combine it with the liquid. And then be careful about over thickening. You have to remember the only way it works is through starch gelatinization. So you add the roux in, but if the liquid's not at almost boiling, the gelatinization will not happen. So you have to let it come up to a boil. Then you see if you need to add more roux or not. All right. So be very careful about adding more roux in until after it's come up to a boil. Then you can determine if it's thick enough or not. In addition to roux, there are some other thickening agents that you can use. Cornstarch is probably another big one. Now, when you work with cornstarch, you make what's called a slurry. And so that's a combination of cornstarch and a cool liquid. You whisk them together, and then you would add that slurry into a hot liquid. Never add cornstarch directly to a hot liquid. You will get lumps. Arrowroot works very similar to cornstarch. In fact, you create a slurry for that as well. You don't see arrowroot as much, A, because it's more expensive than cornstarch, and B, they have pretty much the same thickening powers. The biggest reason that you would want to use arrowroot is a few different. If you're going to freeze your sauce, cornstarch sauces that you freeze end up wanting to separate once you thaw them out. Arrowroot will not. And if you are trying to make a sauce that has a crystal clear like gel, especially in the pastry kitchen, arrowroot is a better bet because it will gel clear, where cornstarch will have an opaqueness to it. So let's say you're trying to do like a raspberry sauce, but you want to have it nice and clear or have a clearness to the sauce, use arrowroot. If you use cornstarch, it will give a cloudiness, or opaqueness to the finished product. Other than that, you're using cornstarch. It's cheap. It does the job just as well as arrowroot does. Beurre Meunier is actually a finishing technique. So it's not typically used to thicken a sauce. It's to add it at the end of the cooking process to help with a little bit more thickening and to add some shine to the product. And what that is it's equal parts by weight of actually whole butter, room temp, and flour. It's kind of cool. You actually mix them together like you're making Play-Doh. Then you put it onto a piece of parchment or onto some plastic wrap, roll it up like a log, and then refrigerate or freeze it. And then when you need it, you just cut off a piece off the end, toss it into the sauce. It melts in, the flour does its thickening, the whole butter helps to add some shine and body to the finished product, and then you've got a good finished sauce. So Beurre Meunier is a finishing technique, but it does do some thickening. Same thing with liaison. A liaison is really a finishing technique. It's actually egg yolks and heavy cream. That definitely will be on your test, just FYI, what is in a liaison. And a liaison is also added at the end of the cooking process. It does a little bit of thickening because of the egg yolks, but it's primarily for adding body and shine with the fat content and everything in the heavy cream and the egg yolks. Once you add a liaison, though, do not boil your sauce because you just added eggs to it, and you don't want to risk the possibility of the eggs curdling and then you got scrambled eggs floating throughout your sauce. So I know when we get into veloutés, one of the secondary sauces utilizes the liaison as a finishing technique. And then the other thickening agent is definitely out there, that's emulsification. Emulsification is where we take something that doesn't want to go together, oil and water, and we force it together through a emulsifier. something that will help bind the fat and the water together. And there's two basic types. There's permanent emulsions and semi-permanent or temporary emulsions. One of the sauces we'll talk about in a little bit, hollandaise, is considered a permanent emulsion, although that's kind of a misnomer because it's very temperature sensitive. Mayonnaise is one of the most common as far as a permanent emulsion. And then temporary emulsions are ones that are just temporary together, then they separate, like your Italian vinaigrette that you have to shake before you use it, because if not, the oil is on the top and the water is at the bottom. So those are some of your other thickening agents that you can use while you are doing different sauce making techniques. This slide right here is probably one of the most important. This is the base for your sauce making within the classic sauces. So these are what they call leading sauces, grand sauces, or mother sauces. And they're the foundation for the hot sauce repertoire within classic cuisine. You will be required to know this on not only test number 1, but test number 2. And not only that, but you need to know the 5 sauces, the liquid that's used to make that sauce, and the thickening agent that's used to thicken that sauce. Okay, I'm going to go over them here, but you definitely need to make sure you have those memorized. And it's actually 15 blanks. And it says, name the 5 mother sauces, their liquids and thickening agents. So it can be the easiest 15 points you get, or it could be potentially detrimental as far as for your test. Just give me an FYI. So let's talk about bechamel. Bechamel is your first. The liquid is milk. The thickening agent is a white roux, because it's a very pale sauce. The next one is velouté. Velouté is made with a white stock. Please note, white stock is the only answer I will accept when it comes to the liquid. If you say chicken stock, it's wrong, because it could be a white beef stock you use, or a white veal stock, or a fish stock. There's a lot of options for velouté, so you got to be generic when it comes to the name. It's just a white stock. The thickening agent is a blonde roux. This is one of those ivory color sauces. So the blonde roux is what you would use for velouté. The next one, espagnole, is a brown sauce. So it would use brown stock. Again, keep it generic. And the brown roux. Then you get into a couple more specialized. Tomato. The tomato sauce is actually, it's interesting, the liquid is tomatoes plus stock. Tomatoes plus stock. The thickening agent is an optional roux, because you might find that just pureeing the tomatoes with the stock and the other seasonings and flavorings and stuff like that, the sauce is thick enough for what you want it to be. If it's not, then you can add a roux to it. Well, you say, what roux do we use? Well, it depends on what stock you use. So I said tomato plus stock. So if you're doing a tomato sauce for a chicken dish, maybe you're going to do tomato plus white chicken stock. So if that's the case, if you do need to use a roux, you'd want to use the blonde roux. If you're doing a beef dish and do tomatoes plus brown beef stock, if you need to use a roux, then you'd want to use the brown roux for it. Right? So hopefully that makes sense. Liquid for tomato sauce is tomato plus stock, and the thickening agent is optional roux. The last is hollandaise, and hollandaise, as I said earlier, is emulsified sauce. So the liquid, the classic liquid, is actually clarified butter. Clarified butter is the classic liquid, and the thickening agent is egg yolks. And that one is extremely important. Egg yolks is the only answer that's acceptable. Eggs is not acceptable because you don't use the whole egg, and egg white is definitely not acceptable because egg white will not act as an emulsifier. Okay? So real quick again, bechamel, liquid is milk, thickening agent is white roux. Velouté, liquid is white stock, thickening agent is blonde roux. Espagnole, liquid is brown stock, thickening agent is brown roux. Tomato sauce, liquid is tomato plus stock, thickening agent is optional roux. And hollandaise, clarified butter is the liquid, and egg yolks are the thickening agent. Again, 15 points right there for you, ladies and gentlemen, and it will be on test number 1 and test number 2. So now let's start talking about those 5 mother sauces and where things come from. The first is the bechamel family. Bechamel is probably the easiest of them. That's why we actually start with it as far as labs are concerned. They're fairly simple and straightforward, and they're fairly easy to produce. Doesn't take a lot of time to do them. So when you are doing a bechamel sauce, you're making this milk-based sauce. And then once you've made this milk-based sauce, you add in different ingredients to it to make small sauces from them. So here you can see within the bechamel family, you have a cream sauce, you have a cheese sauce, you have a Mornay sauce, you have the Nanta sauce, and then you have a Soubise sauce. Those are kind of the standards when it came to bechamel. All of these are in your book on page 222. But I'm going to talk about the two that we're going to be working with primarily. The cheese sauce, of course, is probably one of the best ones. You're adding cheddar or American cheese to it with a little bit of Worcestershire and a little bit of dry mustard. So again, you're making literally what says a nice cheese sauce that you could use for a mac and cheese or for dipping your pretzels or whatever floats your boat. Goes with some potatoes, whatever the case may be. The other fun one, the Mornay, is a variation of a cheese sauce. For that one, instead of adding cheddar cheese, you're adding Gruyere, which is a type of Swiss, and some Parmesan cheese to it. So you're adding Gruyere and Parmesan. I love Mornay as an alternative for pasta instead of a Alfredo. So do a Mornay sauce, or they're great with potatoes. I mean, you have a lot of fun options for it. But the rest of those, as I said, on page 222, if you want to check out what those bases are and what you can make out of it. But we'll be making bechamel as one of our first labs for sauces. The next one is the veloute family. And so the veloute family is divided into three subcategories. So with the veloute, you're doing your white stock and your blonde roux. And then you can go directly into make a fish sauce. And so these are on page 223. The Bercy, the Cardinal, and the Normandy are the three basic ones that you see for veloutes. Then if you don't go there, we're going to go with what we call secondary sauces. And there's two secondaries. There's Allemande and Supreme. So the Allemande, you take your white veloute, your white stock veloute, and you add a liaison, and you add a little bit of lemon juice to it. All right. So that gets added in. Now you've made an Allemande. Now, typically you don't just use an Allemande. You then go into a smaller sauce. You make the Allemande, and then you make, again, classic ones, the Aurora, the horseradish, mushroom, or poulette. We're going to make mushroom sauce. So we're going to add in some sliced mushrooms so that we sauteed, a little bit of lemon juice, and then we add that to the Allemande. And leave it unstrained. So we have those mushrooms that are in that veloute sauce. The other side is the Supreme. And the Supreme, you actually take the veloute and you simmer with mushroom stems and trimmings to release that mushroom flavor. And then you finish it with some heavy cream. So it gives more of an earthiness to it. From there, some classic Supreme sauces, the Alburfa, the Hungarian, and the Ivory. Hungarian is the one that we typically do, and that one is some diced onions that you cook in some whole butter, and then you add the paprika to it for the color and the flavor, and then you stir the Supreme sauce in, and then typically strain it, strain the onions out. So you get the light onion flavor, you get the flavor of the paprika that's being cooked. It's a really nice one to use, especially like over chicken and stuff like that. So again, those you can find, the small sauces you can find in the book for the Allemande and the Supreme sauces, $2.24 for both of those actually. Next one is the Espagnole. With an Espagnole, there's actually just one secondary sauce, and that's the demi-glace. Okay? A demi-glace is actually equal parts brown sauce and brown stock. So equal parts Espagnole and brown stock, reduce it by half. So if you want to make a quart of demi-glace, you get a quart of Espagnole and a quart of basic brown stock, combine them together, let them simmer and reduce until you get back to a quart of finished product. That's a demi-glace. Now, I know a lot of restaurants will use demi-glaze just as itself, and you can seasoned up well. It's a great flavor to it. But then from there, you can make smaller sauces. Now, if you notice, I just said the demi-glaze is the one secondary sauce because that other one there, Juliet, I refer to as the cheater's brown sauce. So Juliet is a little bit lighter. It's very easy, but it's and to me, it's not my favorite. You just take a stock and you thicken it with cornstarch or arrowroot. So the other thing you can do is you can reduce it down until it naturally concentrates. That's a little nicer, but for a Juliet, instead of taking the time and making the Espanol, you just take some brown stock, add some cornstarch to it, boom, you've got a sauce. That's why I call it the cheater's brown sauce, because it takes a lot less time than it does to make a proper demi-glaze. Okay. Within the brown sauce family, within the Espanol family, you've got a bunch of different flavor profiles: Bordelaise, Chaucer. You can see the Chateaubriand, the Cheval, Madeira or Port, Machard de Vin. A lot of different ones there. These are on page 226, 227. My two favorites, two that we will do coming up, is the Bordelaise and the Chaucer. The Bordelaise is a red wine demi-glaze. The Chaucer is a white wine demi-glaze. Thing with the Chaucer, it's also known as a hunter's sauce, is not only as a white wine base, but it also has mushrooms, shallots, diced tomatoes, and parsley, and all those stay in. They don't get strained. So it's a really nice brown sauce to go with different steaks and stuff. The Bordelaise is a very classic red wine base that you simmer with different aromatics. You let them mix with the demi-glaze, and then you strain out the solid pieces. Though both of those are really, really good, and you can do some really fun things with those. But there's the other ones there too. Again, all those are on page 226 and 227 in the book if you want to see what they all mean. Tomato sauce. So you make this basic, this tomato sauce comes together, and then you can make some different small sauces, the Creole, the Spanish, and the Milanese. In our class for 150, we will just make tomato sauce. We won't make small sauces, but I believe they do small tomato sauces in sauces class, if I remember correctly. The small sauces for those are located on page 229 if you want to know what flavors those are. Hollandaise, again, you can make that base Hollandaise, and then you can make different small ones, the Béarnaise, the Choron, Maltese is a fun one too. In our class in 150, we're just going to make Hollandaise, but I know for sure you make the small Hollandaise sauces when you get into the sauces class, CA 156. So for our class, we will do just a Hollandaise. You'll learn how to make Hollandaise, but then you'll learn how to do these small sauces based on Hollandaise when you get into the sauces class, either next semester or the semester after that, typically. When working with Hollandaise, you do have to be aware that you are handling this emulsified butter sauce, and it needs to be held around in the temperature danger zone, which means it's conducive to bacteria growth. So make sure you're using clean and sanitized utensils. Don't prepare the sauce too early. Never hold the sauce more than an hour and a half, 2 hours tops, and you never mix an old batch with a new batch. You make a new batch, get rid of that old batch. Thing is the Hollandaise, if you get it too hot, it will break. It will separate into the oil and the water. If it's too cold, there's butter in it, and the butter is going to solidify. So you got to hold it like around 90 to 110, which is prime time temperature for bacteria growth. That's why you got to be very careful in making sure that you're only holding it and using time as a safety control. You're not using temperature, you're using time as that safety control as far as sanitation is concerned. Right? Some other traditional sauces are butter based. It's interesting how many different things you can do with them. A couple of classic ones that we'll do are Beurre Blanc and Beurre Rouge. Those first two, Beurre Blanc and Beurre Rouge. Beurre Blanc is a white wine butter sauce. Beurre Rouge is a red wine butter sauce. And we'll make both of those in a lab coming up. Compound butter. Compound butter is taking soft whole butter and blending it with flavors. So if you ever made garlic butter before, you made a compound butter. If you are a fan of the butter at Texas Roadhouse, you've had compound butter. There's a lot of different fun things you can do, fun flavors, really. A lot of it's just limited by your imagination as far as what flavors and stuff go in. On page 234 has some different recipes for compound butters. You can go sweet, you can go savory, and really have some fun with those. The next term is a way to do incorporation, and the term is called, the French word is monter à beurre. Monter à beurre. Monter à beurre translates to mount with butter or finish with butter. And so if something says monter à beurre, what they're saying is to take whole butter and you're going to put it into a sauce and you're going to whisk it together till it dissolves into your finished product. Okay? So it's a finishing technique to add body to your finished dish. Okay? Then you get into some fun French terms. You've got beurre fondu, beurre noir, beurre noisette, Meunière butter, and à la Meunière. Fun words, at least for me, I think, to say. So beurre fondu literally means melted butter. So beurre is butter. Fondue means melted. No, fondue does not mean the Swiss cheese dip that you dip your bread and stuff in. That was very popular in the 70s and then made a comeback. Fondue just means melted. So again, if you're using that term, how much fancier does it sound? If I say, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are featuring steamed broccoli with melted butter. Okay, that sounds decent. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are featuring steamed broccoli with beurre fondue. Ooh, wow. That sounds fancy, doesn't it? It's the same thing, right? It's just when you say it in French, it sounds more high-end and it sounds more expensive, right? Beurre noir and beurre noisette are whole butter that you heat up until the milk solids start to turn color. When it starts to turn brown, you've got beurre noisette. When it turns dark brown or almost black, it's beurre noir. It's actually a sauce. It's considered a classic sauce, especially for a lot of fish and seafood. Very, very simple. You saute up some fish and then you put some whole butter in, you brown it, and then you put that brown butter on top of the fish or the beurre noisette, and you've got this really classic, very simple fish dish. So beurre noir is black butter, beurre noisette is brown butter. Now, Meunière butter is brown butter, beurre noisette, that you add lemon juice and parsley to. And that's usually a part of what's called à la Meunière. So à la Meunière means in the style of the miller. That's the literal translation. When we talk about the miller, we're not talking about Miller Lite. We're talking about the historic miller that would take grain and grind it into flour. So anything that is à la Meunière means it's been dredged in flour, and usually seasoned flour, and then usually sauteed. So a classic fish dish would be like sole à la Meunière. You would take the fillet of sole, you would dredge it in seasoned flour, cook it usually in clarified butter. Then once it's cooked, you take it off the heat. You would add in some whole butter, make the beurre noisette. Then classically, you would squeeze fresh lemon juice on the sole, on that fish, sprinkle some fresh parsley, and then pour that brown butter on top. And that would be a very, very classic, simple way of preparing a fish dish. So those are some other different terms that you will see from time to time. Beurre blanc and beurre rouge are really important. Monter à beurre you will see in your classes. So it is important you're familiar with that term, especially so when you see it, you're not like, chef, what's this mean? Okay? Make sure you're trying to get that stuck in your head so you know what it is when the time comes that you need to use it. Some other traditional sauces, pan gravies, we kind of talked about that, where you would cook up a dish and then once you pull the product out of the pan, you would then, there's usually fat in it, you would add some flour and then liquid and then make a gravy out of it. A pan sauce, very similar, that's going into your, I just went like what I just talked about earlier, the sausage gravy for biscuits and gravy, stuff along those lines. And then coulis are typically purees of vegetables and or fruits that are usually strained before serving. You're going to get into coulis more when you get into baking, because you'll do it with fruit-based ones, these purees, and also in sauces, you'll have some opportunities as well. Contemporary sauces, you've got things like salsa and relishes that you'll get into with garde manger. Vegetable juice sauces, we kind of talked about this a little bit. Instead of doing an essence, you do some juicing of veggies and use those either slightly thickened or just natural, like a nage, as a sauce. Broths, we'll talk about more in soup day when it comes to that, but it's another one that you could do. Foams comes into modern cuisine, where you're aerating liquids and purees, adding air to them to create a foam stuff. And if you stabilize it, it holds pretty well. That's a cool one that they do in modern cuisine. And then the flavored oils, we did talk about the flavored oils and vinegars, but you got to be careful with the flavored oils because they are considered TCS, or potentially hazardous foods. And that, ladies and gentlemen, takes us through chapter 11. It's a very, very important chapter, a lot of great information in there, things that you will carry on with you throughout your culinary career here at ICC and out into the industry. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you next time.